The road into the valley was barely a road at all, just a jagged scar through the Appalachian hills, swallowed by mist and memory. Claire had followed it for hours, past rusted fences and empty mailboxes, until the map on her phone blinked out, leaving her alone with the sound of rain whispering against the windshield. Somewhere out there, buried under decades of silence, lay the story she'd come to find, the story of Eli Harland, a man the townsfolk spoke of only in tremors and fragments. They said he was his wife's brother. Her uncle. Her husband. They said their children were born pale and wordless, and that when the last one died, the forest itself seemed to go quiet. The town of Morrow's Edge had buried that history like a disease, sealing away the Harland name with boarded windows and burnt records. But stories rot slowly in places like this, and Claire could feel it, the damp ache of something that still breathed beneath the soil. The air tasted of iron and rot, and every mile deeper into those woods felt like a step backward in time. She stopped when she saw it, a farmhouse crouched beneath a dying oak, its roof buckled inward like a broken spine. The windows were black, the door half torn from its hinges, and yet the wind that swept through the clearing carried a faint, rhythmic creak, like the sound of a cradle rocking somewhere deep inside. Her flashlight caught a sign nailed to a tree, the letters nearly erased by rain and moss. Only one word remained clear enough to read: Harland. Claire tightened her coat against the chill. Somewhere in those woods, the truth was still alive, and she had just stepped into its home. Claire's hands gripped the steering wheel as the last stretch of asphalt gave way to gravel and mud, the kind that made the tires hiss like something alive. The GPS had already gone dark an hour ago, its blue line swallowed by static, leaving her to navigate by instinct and the fading light of an October afternoon. She had driven hundreds of miles for stories before, missing persons, abandoned towns, places where whispers were stronger than facts, but nothing felt quite like this. The people in the last diner she stopped at had looked at her with the kind of pity reserved for the doomed. They told her to turn back before sunset, that the hills past Morrow's Edge weren't meant for outsiders, that some stories were better off buried. But Claire wasn't the kind to turn back. The further she drove, the more the world seemed to peel away. Houses disappeared, replaced by skeletal trees and long stretches of fog that curled low over the ground like smoke. The silence pressed in heavy, broken only by the occasional cry of a crow or the crunch of gravel beneath her tires. Every signpost she passed looked older than the last, letters faded, wood swollen from years of rain. Somewhere out here, the Harland name had once meant something, power, maybe, or fear, but now it was a ghost that clung to the edges of local memory. She came across the first sign of what used to be a community, a collapsed barn, its roof caved in, a rusted truck half buried in vines. The name, Harland Feed Company, was still faintly visible on a warped wooden plank, its paint blistered away by time. Claire slowed the car, snapping a photo through the window. The air felt different here, thicker somehow, like the woods were watching her. Her pulse quickened, not with fear but with the kind of anticipation only a journalist feels when they know they're brushing up against the truth. By the time she reached the tree line, the road had vanished entirely, replaced by a dirt trail slick with rain. She killed the engine and stepped out, the cold cutting through her coat. The smell of earth and decay was everywhere, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear a faint creak that sounded almost mechanical, like a swing moving in the wind. She stood still, listening, until it stopped. Ahead, through the trees, a faint shape loomed, something like a house, or what was left of one. Claire adjusted her camera strap and started walking, her boots sinking into the wet ground, unaware that with each step, she was crossing a threshold that no one from the outside had crossed in decades. The house emerged from the trees like a wound that refused to heal. Claire paused at the edge of the clearing, her breath fogging the air as she stared at the structure she had been chasing through rumor and half-buried memory. The Harland farmhouse was larger than she had imagined, though time had done its best to erase it. The roof sagged in the middle, shingles curling upward like dead leaves. One of the chimneys had collapsed entirely, and ivy crawled over the windows, strangling the glass until nothing inside could be seen. A porch leaned crookedly under its own weight, its boards warped and slick from years of rain. It was the kind of place that looked less abandoned than exiled. Claire raised her camera and took a few tentative shots. Each flash seemed to wake the house for an instant, revealing more of its decay before sinking back into shadow. The sound of the shutter echoed through the clearing, followed by a silence that felt deliberate. She could smell damp wood and rusted metal, and beneath it all something faintly sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. The woods around her were thick, pressing close on all sides, as if trying to reclaim what once belonged to them. The only sign of life was the faint hum of insects hiding in the moss. She stepped onto the porch carefully, testing each plank before trusting her weight to it. The boards moaned under her boots, the sound carrying far too loudly in the still air. A single rocking chair sat by the doorway, its paint stripped bare, moving slightly though there was no wind. Claire's fingers brushed the doorframe, where initials had been carved deep into the wood, *E.H plus M.H, barely visible beneath layers of grime. She traced them gently, knowing what the letters stood for even if she wasn't ready to believe it. The door gave way with a reluctant groan, revealing a hallway swallowed in darkness. Dust hung suspended in the air like fine mist, glinting in the weak light from her flashlight. She stepped inside and felt the temperature drop immediately. The floor was littered with broken glass, rusted nails, and the brittle remains of old photographs whose faces had faded into blankness. Somewhere deeper in the house, a faint rhythmic sound pulsed, a slow, steady creak that seemed to come from above, as if something were rocking gently in the attic. Claire swallowed hard, realizing that what she was standing in wasn't just an abandoned home, it was a mausoleum built from secrets, and every wall seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for her to listen. The first time Claire heard the name, Eli Harland, it was spoken in a whisper by a man who refused to meet her eyes. She had stopped at the only gas station for miles, hoping to get directions and maybe a clue to what had happened in the woods beyond town. The man behind the counter was old, his hands trembling as he counted change, his voice coated with the gravel of too many years and too many cigarettes. When Claire mentioned the Harland farmhouse, he froze. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence before he finally muttered, almost to himself, "You don't want to go looking for him." Eli was wrong. Claire pressed gently, asking what he meant, but the man only shook his head. "He weren't just her husband," he said. "He was her blood in more ways than one." She tried another approach, visiting the diner across the road where the waitress, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and tired eyes, seemed more willing to talk. When Claire brought up the Harlands, the woman's expression tightened. "You heard of Eli?" she asked quietly, leaning close as if afraid of being overheard. "He was the kind of man who thought blood was sacred, so sacred he didn't let it mix with anything that wasn't his." Her voice trembled on the last word. Uncle. Brother. Husband. They all meant the same thing to him. The way she said it made Claire's stomach tighten. By the time she left the diner, the air outside felt colder. Locals on the sidewalk avoided her eyes, crossing the street when she passed. A teenage boy sweeping the porch of a closed hardware store muttered, "He's still out there," though when she asked who, he only grinned nervously and went back inside. It was the same pattern everywhere she went, people spoke of Eli as if he were a curse that might hear its own name. Later that evening, Claire sat in her car just outside town, replaying the conversations in her head. Eli Harland wasn't just a rumor or a name lost to history, he was a living stain on the town's memory, a presence that still clung to their bones. She could feel it, the way they spoke of him, not like a man long dead, but like something that never fully left. A legend, yes, but also a warning. And somewhere beyond the tree line, past the fog and rot, the truth about who he really was waited, buried beneath generations of silence that the people of Morrow's Edge would rather die than disturb. Claire found the photograph by accident. It was late afternoon, the light fading fast, and she had been searching through the wreckage of what once seemed to be the Harland family's living room. The floor was a graveyard of forgotten objects, moldy books, cracked plates, and children's toys half buried in dust. A beam of sunlight slipped through a broken window and struck something glinting beneath a fallen drawer. She knelt down, brushed away the dirt, and pulled out a warped wooden picture frame. The glass was shattered, its jagged edges biting into the corners of the image. The photo inside was old, so old the paper felt fragile as ash. Two figures stood in front of the house she now stood in. A man and a girl. The man was tall, wearing dark overalls and a heavy coat despite the sunlight in the photo. His face, however, had been violently scratched out. Long gouges crossed where his eyes and mouth should have been, cutting through the paper with enough force to tear it. The girl beside him looked no older than 12. Her dress was clean, her hair neatly tied with a ribbon, and she was holding something small in her hands, a doll, maybe, or a bouquet of wildflowers. Her eyes were wide and unflinching, staring straight into the camera, straight into her own frozen history. Claire turned the photo over, expecting to find a date, a name, anything to prove it wasn't what she feared. Instead, there was only one word written in faint pencil, *Mary. The letters were small and hurried, as if whoever wrote them wanted to be remembered but not found. Claire's throat went dry. The waitress at the diner had said Eli's wife was named Mary Harland. His niece. His sister. The thought knotted in her stomach like a sickness. She held the picture closer, tracing the torn outline of the man's face. Whoever had done this wanted him erased, as though removing his image might remove what he had done. Yet the violence of the scratches made it feel the opposite, like the act of destruction had kept his presence alive. As Claire stared, the air in the room shifted. A floorboard creaked behind her, light as a footstep. She turned quickly, the beam of her flashlight slicing through the gloom, catching nothing but the shimmer of dust. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, and she realized she was still clutching the photograph tightly against her chest. The girl's faint smile seemed to follow her as she backed away toward the door, as though even the picture itself was warning her to leave while she still could. The sheriff's office was a narrow, dimly lit room that smelled faintly of old coffee and damp paper. Claire had stopped there hoping to find records, maybe a death certificate or missing persons report tied to the Harland name. The man behind the desk introduced himself as Sheriff Dawson, though he quickly clarified that he'd been retired for over 15 years. His uniform hung on a peg by the wall, faded and wrinkled, as though it hadn't been touched since the last time he'd worn it. When Claire mentioned Eli Harland, the old man went still, his hand tightening around his mug. For a long moment, he said nothing, only watching her with an expression that hovered between curiosity and unease. Then he sighed, sat back in his chair, and said quietly, "You're diggin' where the dirt never settled." He reached for a drawer, pulling out a file so thin it barely seemed worth keeping. Inside were yellowed papers, old reports, a few photographs, and a map marked with a red X over the Harland property. "Most of this ain't official," he said. "Town council made sure of that. But I kept copies. Someone had to." He slid one of the photos toward her. It showed the Harland house as it once was, roof intact, windows curtained, a vegetable garden in the back. "That was before," he muttered. Claire asked what before meant, but Dawson didn't answer right away. He rubbed his temples and leaned forward. "Before the fire. Before they started talking about what Eli was doing up there." He told her the Harlands were once respected, odd, yes, but not feared. They kept to themselves, always had. But sometime in the late 1960s, people started noticing things. Eli stopped coming into town altogether. His family grew in number, but no one ever saw new faces. Birth records listed the same parents, though the mother's maiden name was always Harland. When someone asked questions, Eli sent word through letters, claiming outsiders brought sickness and sin. Then, one by one, the letters stopped. Claire listened, scribbling notes, but it was Dawson's eyes that told the real story, haunted, resigned, as if he'd spent his life trying to forget what he'd seen. He admitted he'd gone up there once, decades ago, after reports of smoke and crying in the woods. What he found, he never put in writing. "There are some things the law can't explain," he said finally, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I saw enough to know one thing. Whatever Eli built in that house, it wasn't a family. It was a prison. And everyone in it was born to serve him." Claire left the station with the file pressed to her chest, feeling the weight of a story the world had tried to bury but never quite could. The graveyard sat behind the Harland farmhouse, hidden beneath a tangle of vines and briars that had crept across the ground like veins. Claire hadn't noticed it at first. It was only when her flashlight caught a glint of metal that she realized the ground was uneven, rising and dipping in soft mounds. As she pushed through the brush, she found them, rows of crude, handmade crosses jutting from the soil at odd angles. Some were fashioned from wood, others from rusted iron rods bound together with wire. There were no flowers, no markers of mourning, only silence and the faint scent of rot that seemed to seep up from the earth itself. Most of the graves had names carved directly into the wood, the letters rough and shallow, as though made by someone who didn't want to spend too much time writing them. Every stone, every plank, every scrap of inscription carried the same last name, Harland. Over and over again. Sometimes two names shared a single marker, sometimes there were no first names at all, just the family name, repeated like a curse. Claire counted at least 20 before she stopped, her throat tight. Near the far corner of the graveyard, one of the crosses had toppled, revealing a small pile of bones that looked far too small to belong to an adult. She knelt, careful not to disturb them, and noticed that the earth around the grave was fresh, as though someone had been there recently. She shone her light farther and saw something glinting among the weeds, a rusted locket half buried in mud. Inside was a photo so faded it was barely visible, but she could just make out the outline of a woman's face. On the back, etched faintly with a knife, were the initials M.H. Claire felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. She remembered the scratched photograph from the house, the girl with the ribbon and the same initials scribbled on the back. It was her grave. Or at least, it should have been. The wind began to rise, whispering through the trees, and the sound it made was almost human. It carried the faint creak of wood shifting, the sigh of leaves brushing one another like voices trying to speak. Claire took a step back, her boot sinking into the soft ground, and felt something crack beneath her heel. When she looked down, she saw a fragment of jawbone peeking through the mud. The realization hit her hard: there were more bodies buried here than graves could count. This wasn't a family cemetery. It was a mass of secrets, buried and forgotten, waiting for someone foolish enough to uncover them. The Harland name wasn't just carved into wood, it was carved into the earth, into the bones beneath her feet, and it wasn't finished whispering yet. Claire had been standing in the ruined parlor for nearly an hour, studying the fragments of the Harlands' life scattered across the floor. The daylight was fading, replaced by the heavy blue of evening that seeped through the shattered windows. Dust floated lazily in the air, catching the weak beam of her flashlight as she moved toward a corner where the wallpaper had peeled away in long, curling strips. The air was thick with mildew, the kind that clung to the back of her throat, but beneath it she caught a faint sweetness, something familiar, like the scent of old cedar and lavender. It was the smell of a child's room, soft and ghostly, lingering long after its owner had gone. She followed the scent to a small wooden box resting on a half-collapsed dresser. It was painted pink once, though the color had faded into the pale gray of ash. Tiny white flowers had been carved into the lid, their edges worn smooth by years of touch. Claire crouched down and brushed away the dust with her sleeve. When she lifted the box, it felt lighter than she expected, almost hollow. A thin chain dangled from the latch, and when she turned it slightly, something inside rattled faintly. She took a breath and opened it. The first sound that escaped was not the creak of wood or the scrape of metal, it was music. Faint, tinny, and off-key, but unmistakably a lullaby. The melody drifted through the room, uneven but hauntingly gentle, as though the mechanism inside was struggling to remember how to play. Claire froze, her breath caught in her chest. She hadn't wound the box. There was no key, no spring that she could see. Yet the song continued, each note slightly slower than the last, the kind of tune meant to soothe a child to sleep. Her eyes darted around the room, half expecting to see movement in the shadows. The music echoed against the walls, filling the house with a sound that didn't belong in the present. It stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a silence so sharp it made her ears ring. Then came a faint thump from somewhere above her, followed by the slow creak of a board shifting under weight. Claire's flashlight shot toward the ceiling, catching nothing but the flicker of dust. Her heartbeat quickened. The air seemed to hum, charged with a tension she couldn't explain. The box in her hands was still warm, as if it had been played by something alive. For the first time since stepping into the house, Claire felt the heavy certainty that she wasn't alone, that something, or someone, was still here, listening to the same song that had once played these halls to sleep. The diary was buried beneath a stack of damp newspapers inside a rotting trunk in the upstairs bedroom. Claire had been prying through the debris for hours, each drawer revealing little more than dust and decay, until her fingers brushed against the spine of something soft and worn. She pulled it free and felt the weight of time in her hands. The cover was made of cracked brown leather, its edges curled, the initials MH faintly carved into the corner. The pages inside were warped and yellowed, the ink faded to the color of dried blood. When she opened it, the scent of mildew rose like breath from a long-sealed mouth. The first few pages were nothing but lists, dates, names, household chores. But as she turned further, the tone changed. The handwriting grew frantic, the letters jagged and uneven, as though written by trembling hands. Claire read by flashlight, her shadow stretching across the wall like a silent observer. The entries began to tell a story of isolation and dread, of a woman trapped in her own home. He says the blood keeps us pure, one line read. He says the world outside is rotten, and that we were chosen to keep what's left of it clean. The word pure appeared again and again, scrawled in places where sentences broke off mid-thought. Mary wrote about the children too, about their strange silence, their eyes that never seemed to focus. They don't cry, one entry said. They only hum that song, the one he made me sing when the babies came. Claire's pulse quickened as she remembered the music box downstairs. The connection sent a cold wave through her. She turned another page and found a passage written darker, as though the pen had nearly torn through the paper. They are not right. Their faces are his, all of them, and their minds are something else. He says it's God's way, but I think God left this place long ago. The later entries grew more desperate, fragmented by fear and guilt. If I run, he'll find me. If I stay, I'll rot like the others. One page had been ripped out entirely, leaving behind only a smear of ink where the words once were. Claire reached the final entry, dated only a week before the supposed fire. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike. He said the blood must start again. He said we'll be born new. The ink bled off the edge of the page as if the pen had been pulled away mid-sentence. Claire closed the diary slowly, her hands trembling. The house around her seemed to tighten, every creak in the wood echoing with the weight of Mary's confession, as though her voice was still trapped between the pages, whispering the truth no one had dared to speak aloud. As the hours passed, Claire began to feel an unshakable awareness that she was no longer alone in the Harland farmhouse. The rational part of her mind reminded her that old houses make noise, that wood shifts as it breathes and settles, but something about the pattern of the sounds felt deliberate. Each time she moved, there seemed to be a corresponding creak from somewhere else in the house, as though her footsteps were being mirrored. The air had grown heavier since she found the diary, the temperature dropping several degrees despite the absence of wind. Her flashlight beam trembled slightly in her hand, cutting through the dust and decay as she moved from room to room, trying to convince herself that the sensation of being watched was nothing more than exhaustion. She stood in the center of the hallway, listening. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of her wristwatch and the rhythmic dripping of water from a hole in the ceiling. Then, faintly, a sound came from upstairs, a soft shuffle, like bare feet brushing against wood. Claire froze, her pulse quickening as she turned toward the staircase. Every instinct told her to leave, but curiosity anchored her in place. She called out, her voice low but steady, identifying herself as a journalist, but the sound dissolved into the empty air without echo. The silence that followed was dense and complete, the kind that seemed to listen back. Determined to maintain control, she began to document everything aloud for her recorder, each sound, each shift in temperature, each sensation. Her voice wavered slightly as she described the smell of dampness mixed with something metallic. Then came another sound, closer this time, a faint exhale that seemed to come from the doorway behind her. She turned quickly, her flashlight sweeping across the room, but there was nothing, only the remains of furniture and the long shadow of her own movement cast against the wall. The beam of light caught the edges of handprints smeared faintly into the dust along the banister, small and uneven, as though left by children long ago. Her logical instincts began to erode under the pressure of the atmosphere. The patterns of noise were too deliberate, the timing too precise to dismiss as coincidence. She found herself glancing over her shoulder with increasing frequency, the feeling of eyes on her neck so strong it bordered on physical. Even the air seemed to move differently, brushing against her skin in slow, deliberate currents. Though she could not see anyone, the awareness persisted, silent and watchful, as though the walls themselves had learned to observe her movements, patient and unblinking. The next morning, after a sleepless night in her car parked just beyond the Harland property, Claire drove into town determined to find proof, something tangible that would turn the whispers and dread into documented truth. The sheriff's file had mentioned inconsistencies in birth records, and she knew that meant there had to be paperwork somewhere that the town hadn't managed to destroy. She found the courthouse at the edge of Main Street, a squat brick building with ivy crawling up its walls. Inside, the air was cool and stale, thick with the scent of aging paper. The clerk on duty was an elderly woman with thin, pursed lips who regarded Claire with the same wary politeness she'd come to expect from everyone in Morrow's Edge. When Claire requested access to historical birth and death records, the woman hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the office door before sighing and unlocking a back cabinet. "Don't say I gave you these," she murmured. The records were handwritten, some dating back nearly a century. Claire laid them out across a wooden table, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the brittle pages. The same name appeared again and again, Eli Harland, listed in various columns, father, uncle, sometimes even witness. The mothers' names were almost always variations of the same one, Mary Harland, or M. Harland, sometimes recorded as niece, sometimes as sister. The ink grew shakier in later entries, as if whoever was writing had done so under pressure or fear. What struck Claire most was how the town's officials had continued to process the documents without question, generation after generation. Each child's name was recorded, their parentage written in neat cursive, as though nothing about the arrangement was unnatural. She turned to a newer section of records, ones that should have reflected the years after the fire that supposedly ended the Harland line. But there, in faded blue ink, she found a recent entry dated only 20 years ago. The name on the birth certificate sent a chill through her: father, Eli Harland. Mother, L. Harland. The clerk's warning echoed in her mind as she realized the Harland line hadn't ended at all, it had merely gone deeper underground, hiding within the cracks of forgotten bureaucracy. She photocopied the pages quickly, her hands slick with sweat, and stuffed them into her bag. As she turned to leave, she caught the clerk watching her from behind the counter, her expression grave and unreadable. "Some names," the woman said quietly, "don't stay dead, no matter how many times we write them down." The words followed Claire out the door, carried on the faint hum of wind that seemed to whisper the same cursed surname with every passing breath. Claire found the old woman living on the outskirts of town, in a sagging cottage surrounded by dying cornfields and a fence made from mismatched wood. Locals had mentioned her in passing, always with lowered voices, calling her Miss Ada, as though even the name carried a kind of superstition. They said she'd been there when the Harlands still walked among them, that she'd seen things no one else dared to speak of. Claire followed a dirt path littered with animal bones and rusted tools until she reached the porch. The woman was already sitting there, wrapped in a shawl that looked older than she was, her cloudy eyes watching the horizon as if she had been waiting. When Claire introduced herself and mentioned Eli Harland, Ada smiled without warmth. "You're not the first to come looking," she said, her voice raspy but steady. "And you won't be the first to wish you hadn't." Claire asked what she knew about him, about the stories buried in the town's silence. Ada's hands trembled slightly as she lit a pipe and took a long, shaky breath. "He wasn't just one man," she said at last. "He was the start of something that thought it could outlive sin. Said his blood was chosen. Said it had to stay pure, no matter what God or nature wanted." Her words came slowly, each one deliberate, like she was pulling them out of some deep, dark well. Claire pressed for details, but Ada only shook her head. "You can't understand what it was like," she whispered. "They didn't come into town much, but sometimes you'd see them, pale, quiet, eyes too wide. Children that never laughed, never played. And him, always behind them, watching." She spat into the dirt and crossed herself. "People say the fire took them. But fires don't burn what's already rotten. That family didn't die. They just went underground. That blood still walks, still hides, waitin' for someone to notice." The words sank into Claire like ice. She wanted to ask what Ada meant by underground, but the woman's gaze had shifted past her, fixed on the tree line beyond the fields. "You'll feel it soon enough," she murmured. "The woods don't forget what they've been fed." A sudden gust of wind rattled the loose boards of the porch, sending a dry leaf spiraling between them. Ada's pipe went out, and she didn't relight it. "If you hear them at night," she said softly, "don't answer. They sound like your own blood calling." Claire stood frozen, the weight of the woman's words pressing against her chest, the air around them thick with something that felt less like warning and more like prophecy. Night fell like a curtain over the woods, swallowing the last traces of daylight as Claire packed her equipment into the car. The interview with Ada still echoed in her mind, heavy with cryptic warnings and half-truths that clung to her thoughts like cobwebs. She had planned to drive back to town before dark, but the narrow road had become nearly invisible in the fog, and something about the forest's silence kept her from moving. She sat behind the wheel, engine idling, headlights cutting shallow beams through the mist. The woods around her felt alive, breathing, shifting, waiting. When she finally turned off the ignition, the quiet that followed was deafening. She told herself she'd rest for an hour before heading out, but the stillness made it impossible to relax. The air was damp, carrying the faint smell of earth and decay. Then came a sound so soft she almost mistook it for the whisper of wind, a faint exhale, followed by a steady rhythm of breath that wasn't hers. Her chest tightened as she leaned forward, scanning the fog beyond the windshield. Nothing moved. Still, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming, heavy enough to make her skin prickle. She grabbed her flashlight, flicked it on, and stepped out of the car. The beam cut through the mist in trembling arcs, catching branches, mud, and the faint outline of trees that seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. Then she saw them, prints in the soft dirt, circling her car. They were small, almost childlike, bare feet pressed deep enough to show every toe. They looped once, twice, around the vehicle, as if whoever made them had been walking patiently, waiting. Claire crouched to study them, her breath quickening. The tracks were fresh. The mud still glistened. She turned her flashlight toward the woods, but the fog swallowed the light whole. The air around her grew colder, dense enough to sting her lungs. Somewhere behind her, a twig snapped. She spun, heart hammering, but again, nothing. Just the empty road, the car, and those silent prints circling it like a ritual. The forest seemed to hold its breath, every sound stripped away until she could hear only the thudding of her own pulse. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a flicker of something pale slipping between the trees, but when she blinked, it was gone. She backed slowly toward the car, her hand trembling on the door handle. The engine stuttered to life, headlights flooding the clearing. The prints gleamed wetly in the beam, leading into the darkness of the woods, and though no one was there, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just beyond the light, waiting for her to follow. Claire drove through the winding dirt road with trembling hands gripping the steering wheel, her eyes flicking constantly between the mirrors and the black stretch of trees ahead. The headlights seemed weaker than before, their glow swallowed by the forest that loomed on both sides. The road felt endless, like it was folding in on itself, leading her deeper instead of out. Every few minutes, she thought she saw movement in the corners of her vision, a pale flicker between the trunks, the sway of something that wasn't wind. She told herself it was exhaustion, the mind's way of punishing fear, but the unease burrowed deeper with every passing second. A mile ahead, the fog grew so thick she could barely see beyond the hood. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then the car gave a hollow cough before dying completely. Silence crashed down again, heavier than before. Claire cursed under her breath and reached for her phone, but the screen was black, no signal, no battery. The air inside the car grew stale, and she felt an odd pressure in her ears, as though the woods were closing around her. She cracked the window to breathe and caught a faint sound drifting from somewhere in the dark, a melody, slow and uneven, like someone humming an old lullaby. The sound was coming closer. It wasn't on the wind, it was deliberate, soft, and human. Claire froze, her heart slamming against her ribs as she strained to listen. The tune stopped, replaced by the shuffle of footsteps on gravel. Small ones, dragging slightly, just outside her door. She held her breath, eyes wide, her body locked in place. Then came a voice, childlike, sing-song, and cracked with something almost broken. "You shouldn't have come here." The words were clear, close enough that she could hear the wet breath between syllables. Claire fumbled for her keys, twisting them in the ignition, but the engine refused to catch. The voice giggled, a sound both playful and hollow, and then silence again. She dared to glance through the window, but the fog pressed thick against the glass, hiding everything. A soft handprint appeared there, smearing slowly down as if someone were dragging their palm along the surface. Another appeared beside it. Then another. Tiny, overlapping shapes pressing from the outside, spreading across every window. Her scream caught in her throat as she turned on the headlights once more. For a split second, through the mist, she saw shapes standing at the edge of the road, too many to count, unmoving, faces pale and twisted, their eyes reflecting the light like glass. The lullaby started again, louder now, echoing through the trees. Claire slammed her fist against the steering wheel, desperate to escape, as the shadows began to move closer, step by step, toward her dying car. The engine roared to life just as the first shadow reached the edge of her headlights, its form more suggestion than body, moving like smoke but leaving footprints in the dirt. Claire slammed her foot on the accelerator, the tires spinning and throwing up gravel as she tore down the narrow road. The figures in the fog blurred into streaks of pale light, and though the car jolted violently over roots and stones, she didn't dare slow down. Her hands were slick with sweat, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and the trees seemed to bend inward as she drove, branches clawing at the roof like they were trying to drag her back. The lullaby still followed her. It was faint now, carried by the wind, but it seemed to echo inside the car itself, in the vibration of the glass and the hum of the tires. She turned up the radio to drown it out, but all she got was static, low at first, then building into a sharp whine that made her ears ache. Through the static, another voice crackled to life, faint and broken, whispering her name. Claire slammed the radio off, panic seizing her chest, but the voice didn't stop. It came from everywhere, the air vents, the floor, the hollow space beneath the dashboard. Then the road ahead split. She didn't remember there being a fork before, but there it was, two identical dirt paths, each vanishing into the same dense fog. Without thinking, she took the right, tires skidding as she made the turn. The woods on this side were different, closer, darker, the trees gnarled and old, their trunks almost human in shape. She drove faster, desperate to find a sign of civilization, a mailbox, a light, anything that didn't feel alive. That's when she saw it, the old Harland house, rising through the mist like a memory she'd tried to forget. It looked the same as in the photographs she'd studied for weeks, the rotting porch, the sagging roofline, the crooked chimney leaning into the trees. Only now, there was a faint orange glow coming from inside, flickering like candlelight. She slowed, her pulse pounding in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but something deeper, some desperate pull for answers, kept her from moving. The air outside shimmered with heat though the night was cold. She stepped out, the sound of her boots crunching on gravel cutting through the silence. The lullaby had stopped. In its place came a low, rhythmic thumping from inside the house, like a heartbeat buried within the walls, keeping time with her own. And somewhere deep in that pulsing dark, a voice whispered softly, "You finally came home." The front door creaked open before Claire even touched it, swinging inward as though it had been waiting for her. The air that drifted out was thick with rot and smoke, heavy with the faint sweetness of something burned long ago. She hesitated on the threshold, the beam of her flashlight trembling across walls lined with photographs. The frames were crooked, their glass cracked, and each picture seemed to capture a different generation of the same face, Eli Harland's eyes staring back through time, duplicated again and again in men, women, even children. The deeper she looked, the more their features seemed to blur together, until it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. The floor groaned beneath her as she stepped inside, her light catching on objects she couldn't fully recognize, old dolls' missing eyes, yellowed baby shoes strung together by their laces, and a table covered in wax drippings and dried petals. Every corner seemed to whisper. The air buzzed faintly, as if the house itself was alive and remembering. A sudden crash from upstairs made her freeze. The sound was followed by soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth above her. She swallowed hard, forcing her legs to move toward the staircase. Each step complained under her weight, the railing slick with damp dust. Halfway up, her flashlight flickered. When it steadied, she saw something smeared on the wall beside her, a series of handprints, too small to be adult, pressed in dark, dried streaks that looked disturbingly like blood. They trailed upward, leading to the second floor. Claire's breath came fast and shallow, her body screaming to run, but curiosity pulled her forward like a hook in her chest. At the top of the stairs, she found a long hallway lined with closed doors. One stood slightly ajar, flickering light spilling from within. The humming started again, low, melodic, and unmistakably familiar. It was the same lullaby she'd heard in the woods. She pushed the door open, and the smell hit her, metallic, wet, and old. The room was lit by a dozen candles, their flames dancing in the stale air. In the center sat a cradle, rocking gently though no one was near it. Inside was a bundle wrapped in tattered cloth, moving ever so slightly, as if something inside was breathing. Claire's knees went weak. Behind her, the floorboards creaked. She turned slowly, and there he was, Eli Harland, or what remained of him, standing in the shadows, his face stretched and wrung, eyes glowing faintly like dying embers. His mouth moved, whispering something she couldn't understand, but it sounded like her own name. The cradle stopped rocking. The candles guttered out one by one. And before the dark swallowed her whole, Claire understood what Ada meant when she said the blood never died, it only waited for someone to come home.